Welcome, welcome, welcome. We have an awesome conversation in line for us today. We are going to continue talking about Latinx history in Milwaukee, making sure to begin our conversation with the Chapman Hall Takeover because of the ways that we hope to make this conversation and other conversations very functional and usable in the classroom. We are using quite a number of images as important text and important historical documentation so that we can encourage our students and others to jump into the process of being a historian with us. And so this month, June, we've been talking about Latinx history, and we have some pretty important conversations for the remainder of the month that we'll talk about at the end. I'm Robert Smith. I'm the director of the Center for Urban Research, Teaching, and Outreach at Marquette University. And my partner in this process has been Adam Carr. Adam, you want to introduce yourself real quickly?
Yeah, Adam Carr. I'm a man of multiple hats. Usually I just wear a brewer's hat, but I got involved with Rob in the course of the open housing marches, the 50th anniversary, and I do a variety of different work around community storytelling. And since the pandemic shut everything down, it just made sense to start convening some conversations about the open housing marches, and we were inspired to go beyond. So that is why we're here today.
Awesome, awesome. Let's do an introduction of our two guests today. We have Dr. Sergio Gonzalez and Dr. Joe Rodriguez. Sergio's a professor over at Marquette University, and Joe's a professor over at UW Milwaukee. Welcome, gentlemen. You want to say a little bit about yourselves real quickly? We've got 11 attendees, so we've got a good crowd of folks joining us thus far. That number will probably increase a little bit. Sergio, tell us a little bit about yourself.
My name is Sergio Gonzalez, Assistant Professor of Latinx Studies in the Departments of History and Languages, Literatures, and Cultures at Marquette. Just finishing up my second year at Marquette. I focus specifically my research on Latinx Milwaukee, and specifically on religion and faith spaces as places for community formation and social movements. My first book was called Mexicans in Wisconsin, and my next project is on the history of Milwaukee and kind of the surrounding areas. Latino communities sought to build spaces where they felt spaces of dignity and belonging in the state.
Cool. Go ahead, Joe. Tell us about yourself.
I'm Joe Rodriguez, professor and chair of the Department of History at UW Milwaukee, and I also teach in the Urban Studies program as well, and I'm also an affiliate of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. And I consider myself an urban historian mostly, but I came here in 1991 from California. I came to Milwaukee, and I've done some research on Latino history, done some oral histories of Latino activism, published a couple of books on the history of Latinos in Milwaukee, and but I've written a couple of books on more general urban planning history, and now I'm writing a book on the automobile and minority communities and how it affected cities. So.
All righty, Adam, let's jump right into it.
Actually, Keisha, this is going to be the 4 sections here. And I know a lot of the folks have been here before. Just one thing I want to introduce as part of the way that we like to do things is the chat is open right now. So if you have any comments or questions as we go, that's something we encourage you to do throughout the process and not just wait till the end. So these are the different sections we're going to be going through. We're going to be looking at a bunch of images, history and understanding, then thinking about how to teach this in the classroom, and then the announcement. So let's go to the next slide. And with that, we're going to look at a bunch of images now and sort of discuss what we can understand and learn from them about activism in the movement in this moment. And I think both of you in how you introduced yourselves connected to why this narrative of the Chapman Hall takeover is one that I think connects to your expertise in a lot of different ways. Just getting the images here. That is a spoiler alert. Hold on one second. And There we go. So let's look at these images here of the Chapman Hall takeover. And you guys, let's go through the first section of what the occupation looked like. And then we can go back through and use the images to guide your comments. So these are the different images we have just of the occupation at UW Milwaukee. All right, that's our first section. So esteemed professors, do you want to talk a little bit about what we're seeing here?
I think one point to make, and Sergio, can make this point as well. But this was a community event as well as student event. So I think most of the people here are community members. There weren't that many Latinos on campus at this time. So this was a real, so you see kids, you see older people, younger people. It was really an attempt to bring the community to have influence over the university in recruitment of students, to have the university more involved in the community.
Yeah, Joe's right. I mean, so at the time in 1969, 1970, there were fewer than 20 Latino students on the entire campus at UW Milwaukee. And I think the thing to remember, and we can talk about this a little bit as we go through some of the other images, is that the Chapman takeover in 70 is really a culmination of many years of protest work happening in Milwaukee and across the state of Wisconsin by different Latino communities. So we're going to see some different people in these pictures. And a lot of the people here are in their early 20s, right? Late teens, but some of them are already veterans of civil rights organizing, of labor organizing, and of anti-war protesting, kind of within that spirit of the late 1960s, early 1970s.
I just want to point out something I've never noticed before. You can't have a protest in Milwaukee or in Wisconsin without a bunch of milk. Look at all that milk.
Got the guy holding a bottle up there. Yeah, look at that.
Feel free, gentlemen, to not only talk about the historical context, but then talk specifically about what you see in the images. Because in the classroom, obviously, and we'll get to this in our subsequent sections, we want to encourage students to engage with the images so that they too are a part of history making as they interpret the past. And attendees, jump in, please join us. Offer your thoughts, offer your comments. Go right ahead, folks.
Can I ask you guys a specific question? Well, one comment, this guy reading here looks like that's an outfit that you'd find on UWM today, like exactly from every piece of it. But so there's one of the pieces of this story that I think is really interesting is just the mechanism by which they took the office over. Can you guys get into a little bit of how students, so this is before smartphones, before social media, how they were able to organize this takeover of the chancellor's office? Like, what were the specific mechanisms by which that happened?
Well, I think there were, and Milwaukee sort of, I think, is distinctive in this. There were a lot of nonprofit and a lot of already, as Sergio said, previous to this, there was a group called CELA, which was promoting the improvements in Latino education. And also there'd been activism at the MPS, demanding bilingual education. There was a local newspaper called La Guardia. And so those kind of connections were, I think, key in bringing the university issue to the forefront. So activists had been active in MPS protests. And then the other point to make, and again, Sergio can amplify on this, is that this is a protest composed of Mexicans and Puerto Ricans. So there is that the two communities are combining their forces here. And so this is something that's unique to Milwaukee, maybe, or distinctive of the protests here, unlike California and Texas and the Northeast. This is a combination of different groups. So the use of pan-Latino terms like Latino or Spanish speaking kind of comes out of that.
Yeah, and Joe's exactly right. I mean, so if we want to trace the history of this, the first real protests in Wisconsin around Latino issues in 1966, migrant farm workers organized in Watoma in central Wisconsin. And a lot of the veterans of that organizing, people like Jesus Salas and others, are in this room, are part of this protesting right here, right? So in Adam, to your question of how did people kind of congregate and organize and get into this space? Well, they knew each other. A lot of that protesting that happens in rural Wisconsin then moves into urban spaces as migrant farm workers move into places like Milwaukee, and as the Puerto Rican community grows, as people move in from either Chicago or directly from the island. And so there's kind of this atmosphere that's happening. I mean, we spent the last few weeks here through Curto's work here talking about the 1966-67 marches, and a lot of these young students, it's impossible for them to not know what's happening in the city of Milwaukee. Many of them were marching as well for open housing. And so they see the work that they're doing here, specifically education rights, as kind of part and parcel of their civil rights work that they've been doing in the city for 5, 6, 7 years.
So I just want to point to the fact that one of your colleagues, Joe at UWM, Raul Deal, created with a bunch of students a mural, the Culture Work mural on First and Mitchell, that kind of just nails exactly what you discussed, Sergio. It starts in Watoma, or actually it kind of starts in an intentionally ambiguous agricultural space, but it moves through Watoma and actually culminates into some of these images here, the Chapman Hall Takeover. So now we're going to move on to some of the images of folks around campus. Now this is what they, obviously we're in the chancellor's office, but this is the protests making their presence being felt in different parts of campus, including in the library, looking for Spanish-speaking texts and finding none, going and using some of the campus services and finding them broken or inadequate for their purposes. So do you guys want to talk about that part a little bit?
Well, let me just say a little bit about UWM. I mean, it was only created in 1956, and it was created, in the context of UW-Madison having offered some courses in the extension here in Milwaukee, and you really couldn't get a degree, a 4-year degree, unless you were allied with Madison. And so when UWM was created, there was some pushback from Madison administrators. Should there be an urban campus? And one of the ways that UWM administrators made the case for a campus here is they said, look, this is a big city, a growing city. We need a campus that addresses urban issues. So the idea of the urban university, as far as UWM administrators said, was we're going to help solve urban problems. And if you make that your mission statement, then people are going to take you seriously and said, well, we have problems, right? We have segregation, we have poverty in the Latino community in the South Side and in the North Side as well. So you have to address these problems. If you're going to promote yourself as an urban campus that's going to solve social issues, you need to recruit Latino students. You need to have courses that are germane to the Latino population on your campus.
Joe. Go ahead, Rob. I was just jumping off of Joe. I mean, the thing to remember here is that, I mentioned there are fewer than 20 Latino students on the entire campus. It's only been around a few years, but in 1970, there were over 30,000 Latinos who called Milwaukee home. And it'd be easy to say that there's kind of this boom or this explosion of population, Latino population of the city. But the reality is that Latinos have lived in Milwaukee since the late 19th century and in large numbers since the 1920s. And so I think one of the questions that a lot of these people are asking in these images, right? And by occupying this space and by directly talking to a librarian, as you see in this picture here, is asking, why are we not physically present on this space if we are physically present in the city? Why is it that our labor is needed in industry, whether that's in agricultural in the rural parts of the state or in the tanneries and foundries that make Milwaukee the machine shop of the world? Why is it that we're invited to this space to be workers, but not to be full participants in the community? And so these students are basically demanding to have equal representation and to have an equal spot at this urban institution.
We've got a couple of really great comments. I appreciate Sergio and Joe for adding that context. We got some great comments here from Irigid. And then also Laura Matthews. Let's get to some of these. Irigid is saying here that these spatial visuals render visible, ordinary, and invisible hierarchies that we otherwise miss. These hierarchies become the very ways in which power and oppression is made habitual and invisible in our worlds. He's also giving us some really important commentary about how these images highlight how spatial hierarchy gets challenged in reverse for important understandings of the moment. Can you talk about what these images are telling us about the challenges and the resistance to hierarchical oppression?
Hey, Adam, can you go back to that slide with the music? So this image is fascinating to me because I'm right now I'm working on this chapter on 1950s Milwaukee and the arrival of Puerto Rican migrant workers in the city. And when Puerto Ricans arrived in the city, they were recruited as basically single men to work in factories and foundries. And they didn't have much to do other than work in the city. There were not recreational spaces that were made for them or that they could call their own. And one of the things that they did is that they brought their guitars and they played on their stoops and they played in the streets. And this upset a lot of Milwaukeeans who looked at them as being racially different, linguistically different, culturally different. Police harassed them for playing their music on their street. They were called in front of the judge, put into jail for basically just recreating. And so we talk about the way in which these students were, or future students were disrupting space. You see this image right here. These students weren't just asking for the right to sit in a classroom and to pay tuition at UW-Milwaukee. They wanted to have themselves represented in all aspects of that school, right? And so they're bringing the things that are important to them, whether that's the music and the music that's fueling their movement into these spaces as well.
And that was part of the demand that there should be courses on the culture of these groups. And so courses on Latino lit and history. And some of these courses eventually were offered in the South Side, in the community, as opposed to on campus. But the drums are classic for the Puerto Rican population, right? The drum is signifying the African diaspora here in the United States.
Laura,
can I just say you guys are doing a really good job.
Laura asks a really good question here, which is how involved were different sectors of the non-Latinx student population in the takeover, if at all? Were there some allies in that fight?
Yeah, I think there were faculty members because the university was young. It had to recruit very quickly faculty, and some of the faculty members themselves were young or had been involved in civil rights and anti-war protesting. So there were faculty members in Department of Ed, I believe, who were really involved in, in the social movements and wanting to push for a more diverse campus that were very helpful in trying to push the administration to recruit more faculty and of color and to recruit more students.
Yes. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I was just going to say we want to give a shout out to Abby Nye. What's going on, Abby? She wants to make sure folks know that these images are available at the UWM archives. And
I'm also selling them for $10 a piece. Sorry, Abby actually helped me out with something this week, so that was a bad joke for a lot of reasons. Thanks, Abby.
we tell bad jokes on a regular basis when we do this, so.
No, but really, I just went to the UWM archive, downloaded all the images to share here. So it's important that that shout out is very clear that these are all in the UWM collection.
And along with the images, we also have news footage and other documents too that are available. And so just real quickly, gentlemen, talk a little bit about the importance of these collections being available through archives and how important it is for us to know that they are available and access them and use them either in the classroom or at home or what have you.
I'll say this, I just finished up my dissertation a few years ago, and it was a struggle to really find the archives of Wisconsin's Latino populations that have been preserved. I think this is something that archivists across the state, whether they're at UW-Milwaukee or at the Wisconsin Historical Society, they've been doing a lot of good work in the last few years to kind of catch up with some of the work that should have been done a long time ago, which is to preserve the history of a community that's been here for over 100 years, a community that has considered itself a part of Wisconsin's history for that very same amount of time. And so to have these images not only preserved, but digitally available for educators. I use these in my urban history class all the time as well. It's so important.
Yeah.
And we have one more question, and then I'm sure that Command Central is going to start moving us forward. How did the institution respond And let's offer some thoughts about UWM, if you have any thoughts about Marquette, but then also if you can talk to us about Latinx student movements more broadly. How do institutions respond to this upsurge in the demands for more inclusion on campus, both
And I
people
think this,
and then also curricular?
yeah, this last sweep of images, I think, gets into that. So why don't I just show the rest of those? These are images specifically grouped around police interactions. And then also the final images, which might give away a little bit of institutional response. This is sort of claiming a victory. So just wanted to share those to get us into the conversation about institutional response.
Well, you know, one result was the creation of what was called the Spanish Speaking Outreach Institute, which was a center to assist in recruitment of students, to assist in student success on campus. And that name kind of symbolizes the Pan-Latino identity. There were classes on the South Side that were offered in Latino topics like Latino Lit. So those were some of the responses. I mean, maybe negatively, the community expected more input into what the university was doing. There was some of that, but there wasn't as much as the community wanted. And there's always a struggle to recruit, you know, Latino faculty and students. But there was some progress.
Yeah, I mean, and to proceed kind of Joe's point, I mean, we kind of see the immediate response from the institution, which is to call the police, right? Students started first, their first tactic was kind of very performative acts of occupation, right? To come and go to the library and demand books in Spanish when they knew very well that there weren't books in Spanish, to go to the registrar and to see all the classes that were available for Latino students, those weren't available. And so when they actually occupied this space, the university responds with force and tries to push them out. But these students, these activists are not to be deterred, and they come back and occupy the chancellor's office again. I mean, you can see that they turned this into an event, and it was an opportunity for them to celebrate the work they've done and the work that they continue to do. And you know, this is continuing on at campuses today. Students on campuses across the country, whether it is students who are fighting for ethnic studies and for the hiring of professors of color, professors who look like them and who teach the things that care or that matter to them, or whether it be unionization efforts in places like Marquette, where graduate students and non-tenure track faculty continue to protest and to organize and to basically fight for the right to collectively bargain and to have representation at the table for themselves.
And let me send a couple of shout outs. Thanks, folks. Heather Godley, thank you so much for joining us. Heather has been really instrumental in making sure we are moving our conversations into very functional classroom mechanisms and tools. And also, let's shout out Kristen Leffelman from the Wisconsin Historical Society, who reminds us that indeed folks should check out the Somos Latinas Oral History Project from the Wisconsin Historical Society. And she dropped the link there in the chat for us. And the Historical Society has digitized collections that are very useful as well. So we appreciate you folks taking part with us.
You know, something just while you were talking there, Sergio, the reverberations, or actually with both of what you were saying about both the institutions responding, but then also some of those being performative or inadequate. I can't help but think what just happened last week in MPS and MPD, right? That was Leaders Igniting Transformation, and others had been advocating for years for MPS to cease its contracts with the Milwaukee Police Department. And the MPS was able to voted unanimously to cut a lot of them, but not all, which is a little bit counter to the narrative people are offering. But yeah, I mean, these stories don't exist in isolation in a distant space. But I would argue, and this might get us into some of the other conversation, that a lot of the students were out in the street advocating for MPS to drop those MPD contracts don't know about this story of the Chapman Hall takeover. And through no fault of their own, mm-hmm. I think. Can you guys talk a little bit about the loss of these stories and how, like, it's particularly within institutions like Milwaukee Public Schools, and what you think some of the stakes are of the fact that these stories have become relatively obscure in our popular narratives?
Well, I'll tell you that one thing, and I think this is kind of a personal mission of mine, is to really disrupt the black-white binary that we tell a history of Milwaukee, right? I mean, the history that, if we know any history about civil rights organizing in Milwaukee, it's the very important history of the open housing marches of the mid-1960s and kind of the reverberations of that. But the reality, of course, is to talk about the civil rights movements that occurred in Milwaukee is very multifaceted, as including Latinos and women's rights movements and LGBTQ movements that happened in the early 1970s, right? And all of these are kind of happening as lineages, as kind of reverberations of what happens in the 1960s. We talk about efforts today to address police brutality and the different ways in which our schools have become militarized. In the late 1960s, early 1970s, Latino activists in Milwaukee, Mexican American and Puerto Rican, are fighting for the exact same thing. They start first protesting for welfare rights in 1969 when the state of Wisconsin tries to slash welfare allocations for Wisconsinites, and that leads to confrontations with police in the city streets of Milwaukee. And Latino activists then reframe their conversations, not just about welfare rights, but about the rights of poor people in the city, including the way in which they're forced to interact with police officers.